Hi everyone, thank you for coming today. I'm Will. I'm a second year undergraduate philosophy and psychology student here at Durham University, and I'm here to talk to you today about my ongoing conceptual research titled Breaking Psychological Barriers to Physical Activity, a Cyclical Model for Improving Mental Health Outcomes in the Northeast. I want to begin by setting out the problem that this work aims to address, because I think it's really important to be clear from the outset that this is not research that is looking to argue that physical activity is unimportant for mental health. The evidence base for that claim is crystal clear and already very well established, and this work is not at all looking to undermine that. Instead, the motivation for this work comes from the tension between how physical activity is typically positioned within mental health interventions and the lived realities of people experiencing long-term psychological difficulties, particularly in regions of high deprivation such as the Northeast. The northeast of England consistently records some of the lowest levels of physical activity in the UK, alongside some of the highest levels of socioeconomic deprivation and disproportionately low mental health outcomes. For example, Sport England's Active Lives research from the 2024-25 academic year showed that over 50% of school-aged children fall short of the active criteria, which is 60 minutes plus a day, for exercise. While this picture is more mixed in adults, the Northeast still ranks among the least active regions nationally when compared with other parts of the UK. This matters because physical activity is now deeply embedded in psychological and psychiatric practice. Physical activity features prominently in behavioural activation for depression, in interventions for anxiety disorder, and in support programs for people with ADHD, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia spectrum conditions. Physical activity is often treated as a low-cost, scalable, and broadly effective intervention, and in many respects, that assessment is justified. However, despite widespread promotion of exercise-based approaches, physical activity levels in the Northeast have remained persistently low over time. Now, at first glance, you may point towards the idea that this is likely a resource problem, a lack of facilities, opportunities, or investment, perhaps a byproduct of years of socioeconomic inequality. But when we look at the regional physical activity landscape, that explanation becomes less convincing. The Northeast already hosts a wide range of initiatives aimed at increasing activity, spanning many different sectors, from major football foundations such as the Newcastle United Foundation, who alone reports supporting 69,849 people in the last year, to non-football community initiatives such as the Eagles Community Foundation, who delivers community-based physical activity opportunities through basketball. Local authorities also provide opportunities through initiatives such as Active Newcastle and Active Sunderland. School-based programs, third sector organisations, and local partnerships further add to this landscape. In other words, this is not a region where nothing is being offered, and yet both engagement and sustained participation remain limited, particularly among those experiencing the poorest mental health outcomes. I hope this is the point where the motivation for this research becomes clearer. If opportunities exist, and if benefits of physical activity are well established, then persistent low engagement must suggest a deeper explanatory problem. The concern should not necessarily regard access or provision, but whether our current ways of conceptualising and understanding the relationship between physical activity and mental health are sufficient. Many dominant psychological frameworks, some of which I'll discuss in greater detail later on, tend to treat physical activity as an appropriate starting point for improving mental health outcomes. However, this assumption sits uneasily with the temporal depth of many mental health difficulties. If we consider some common symptoms of many mental health issues, low motivation, emotional dysregulation, fatigue, avoidance, reduced self-efficacy, these symptoms often predate clinical diagnosis by weeks, months, or even years, and may have already shaped patterns of inactivity long before any intervention begins. The concern then is that by treating physical activity primarily as a solution, we risk overlooking the barriers that may have reduced activity in the first place. It is this concern, as opposed to any rejection of physical activity as an intervention, that motivates my proposal of a cyclical model, one that takes seriously the possibility that psychological barriers and inactivity are mutually reinforcing rather than sequential. So, having hopefully set up the problem, I now want to be explicit about the dominant assumption that sits in the background of a lot of clinical practice, public health messaging, and behaviour change work around exercise and mental health. The assumption is both essentially linear and unidirectional, and it goes like this. If we increase physical activity, mental health outcomes improve. And I really want to emphasise from the outset, this assumption has not just been baselessly invented. There is strong evidence that physical activity can reduce depressive symptoms and generally improve well-being. Exercise is a recommended intervention within mainstream guidance for mild to moderate cases of depression, with it usually taking the form of structured group exercise. But my point today is narrower than that, and it goes like this. The linear causal story is often treated as the default starting structure, and that has consequences, especially in settings where psychological barriers are already doing heavy causal work. The cleanest clinical example is definitely behavioural activation. Behavioural activation is widely used as a pragmatic therapeutic approach, and its evidence base is strikingly strong, despite it being a relatively recent development. Behavioural activation primarily attempts to get individuals to engage in valued, meaningful activities in hopes of reducing avoidant behaviours and improving mood. It has a particularly strong evidence base in depression, and there is good reason for that, as it's a real workhorse intervention in real-world services. Now, behavioural activation isn't just physical activity. Of course it isn't. However, physical activity is often one of the most visible behavioural targets in behavioural activation. The implicit causal logic there then frequently reads as increase in activity leads to increase in reinforcement, which then leads to improved mood. The important point here is that even when behavioural activation is delivered well, it is still predicated on the assumption that the patient has enough psychological capacity, enough motivation, enough energy, enough self-efficacy to initiate and sustain behavioural change. In other words, this intervention leans on psychological resources that, in many cases, we are concerned with, are precisely what is depleted. So, in that regard, behavioural activation is a good example of how the unidirectional, linear picture is partly true and clinically useful, while also being vulnerable at the point of initiation. We can see this same linear causal structure very clearly in public health messaging. For example, recent collaborative initiatives between the NHS and Sport England, such as the 2025 Let's Move campaign, as is pictured on the left-hand side of the screen, explicitly promote increased physical activity as a means of improving both mental and physical well-being. The underlying logic is straightforward and, importantly, both informed and evidence-based. Physical activity is good for mental health, therefore increasing physical activity is a reasonable lever for improving population-level well-being. And again, this isn't wrong. The difficulty is what this framing leaves in the background. Campaigns like this necessarily focus on behaviour change, on getting people to move more, but they tend to underspecify the psychological conditions required for people to engage with these messages in the first place. So, when exercise prescriptions or public health campaigns fail to translate into sustained engagement, this is often interpreted as a problem of uptake or motivation. But an alternative interpretation, and the one I consider to be most likely, is that these approaches rely on psychological resources such as motivation, emotional regulation, executive function, and a sense of agency that are already compromised in precisely the populations they aim to support. So the issue is not that exercise is ineffective, of course not, but instead that the causal burden is placed too late in the process. Now, what I find personally really interesting about this linear causal assumption is that even models that explicitly acknowledge complexity can end up reproducing the same default structure. Let's take COM-B, for example. For those of you that don't know, COM-B is a behaviour change model that claims behaviour is shaped by three things: capability, opportunity, and motivation. It's an excellent framework because it forces you to look at psychological capacity and environmental constraints, and thus beyond just individual choice. But in practice, COM-B is often applied in a way that treats physical activity as the behaviour to be increased, with motivation and capability treated as inputs to be built up in order to produce the behaviour. This implementation risks overlooking how those very capacities are themselves being eroded by poor mental health and deprivation over time. The model implicitly assumes that the individual has a baseline of 0 to work from, but deprivation often moves that baseline below 0. And if this erosion is stronger than the feedback from the activity, the model necessarily fails in practice. I suppose a useful way of illustrating this would be to imagine a person running a race with a leak in their fuel tank. In that sense, the causal linear story can also appear within a model that conceptually is not linear. So, to summarise this section, the dominant assumption of linear causality, that increasing physical activity leads to improved mental health, shows up across clinical interventions, public health messaging, and behaviour change frameworks. It is partly true and supported by a strong evidence base. But the problem is that, as a default causal structure, it risks treating inactivity as the starting point for intervention when, in many cases, inactivity is already a downstream expression of earlier psychological barrier states, shaped by mental health symptoms and socioeconomic context. In this next section, I want to really slow down and make that claim concrete. I'm going to shift from models and messaging to the mechanisms of constraint. Specifically, how psychological barriers can precede inactivity, produce inactivity, and then become entrenched once inactivity is established. And I do want to again be clear here that none of this is an argument that exercise doesn't work. It's an argument about when the exercise lever is realistically available, for whom, and under what psychological and contextual conditions. Now, the first point is what I've been referring to as the temporal depth of mental health problems. Now, mental health difficulties almost never begin at the moment of diagnosis. Diagnosis is really just an administrative or clinical threshold and must not be regarded as the beginning of the condition. For many people, there is a long preclinical phase, weeks, months, or even sometimes years, where symptoms gradually develop, coping strategies shift, daily routines become narrower and potentially fewer, and behaviour changes long before any formal label is applied. And this matters for physical activity because physical activity is not just a discrete behaviour you can switch on and off. It's embedded in routines, confidence, identity, social context, physical capacity. And therefore, when those begin to degrade early on, the individual doesn't just stop exercising, their entire behavioural world contracts. So it is extremely important to keep in mind that when an individual comes into contact with clinical services or a structured intervention, the physical inactivity may not be a fresh problem, so to speak. It is likely that it may already be the product of a much longer process, a kind of behavioural sedimentation, if you will, where inactivity has become stable and self-reinforcing. Now, that is the first break in the linear story. This linear causal approach often imagines an intervention arriving at a clean starting line. But in reality, many people arrive having already been shaped by the barriers that have predated the intervention. The second point is that physical activity is often described, especially in public health messaging, as low cost. Walk more, move more, get outdoors, do something manageable. Now, financially, that can be true. But psychologically, physical activity can be extremely high demand. To initiate and sustain activity, you typically need enough motivation to start, enough self-efficacy to believe you can do it and keep doing it, enough emotional regulation capability to tolerate discomfort, embarrassment, or uncertainty, enough executive function capability to plan, initiate, sequence, and follow through, and often enough social confidence to be seen doing it in public places. So when we say exercise or physical activity is a low-cost intervention, what we really mean is the behaviour itself is simple. But the behavioural act is not the full cost. The full cost surely includes the psychological prerequisites. And here is the key tension. Many mental health symptoms erode exactly those prerequisites. So the intervention is not merely asking for behaviour, it is asking for behaviour using capacities that the condition has already depleted. And I want to make this even more explicit by walking through a few common clinical presentations Of course, not to teach anyone diagnostic criteria, but to show the functional pathway from symptom to inactivity. So first, let's take depression. If we think specifically about major depressive disorder, or MDD for example, you get symptom clusters such as fatigue, anhedonia, psychomotor agitation or slowing, and feelings of hopelessness. Now, notice what they do to the prerequisites I just mentioned. Fatigue directly removes energy available for initiation. Anhedonia removes the expected reward, the expected reward signal that helps sustain repetition. Psychomotor agitation or slowing changes the felt effort of moving itself. And feelings of hopelessness undermines the expected payoff of engaging with physical activity. That why bother? In that context, inactivity isn't really a choice among options. Instead, it's just what happens when the internal engine that enables initiation and reinforcement is not functioning normally. So, when the clinician prescribes physical activity, they're not just offering a helpful tool, they're placing a behavioural demand on a system whose motivational and energetic machinery is potentially impaired. That's why exercise can be genuinely therapeutic for depression and yet still difficult to implement at the very point it would be most helpful. Now, let's consider anxiety. Let's take generalized anxiety disorder, for example, or GAD, but the point generalizes. With anxiety, some of the central symptoms are sensitivity to threat and anticipatory worry. As a result, avoidance among those with anxiety often becomes a central regulatory strategy. Here, the pathway to inactivity can be very different to that of depression. It's not that the person lacks energy necessarily, sometimes they have plenty, but instead the issue is that activity contexts can become threat contexts. Gyms can become evaluative or judgmental spaces. Outdoor spaces can feel unsafe or unpredictable. Group classes can trigger social scrutiny. Even going for a run can feel like an exposure to judgment. So, for many anxious individuals, avoiding physical activity settings altogether is not irrational. It's actually psychologically coherent. It's protective in the short term. And if avoidance is functioning primarily to reduce threat, then simply telling someone to increase exercise can inadvertently ask them to do the very thing their anxiety system is organised to prevent. So that means that non-engagement or non-adherence is not necessarily a motivation deficit. It can instead be thought of as an avoidance-based regulation strategy that makes perfect sense given the individual's lived experience. Symptoms of ADHD also produce inactivity through a different pathway, particularly via difficulty with initiation and consistency, but for reasons of time, I won't unpack that mechanism here. The important point is that the causal structure is the same. Inactivity emerges from upstream psychological constraints rather than simple choice. So across these three examples, you can see something important emerge, and that is that the causal pathway to inactivity is not uniform. In depression, inactivity may be driven by energy depletion and reward disruption. In anxiety, it may be driven by threat and avoidance dynamics. In ADHD, it may be driven by initiation and executive function limitations. But they all share a common structure. In each case, inactivity is not merely co-occurring with mental health, it is being produced by the symptom profile. And that symptom profile can become stable long before anyone gets to the point of intervention. Now, this for me is where the linear assumption begins to misfire a little bit. If we assume this sort of activity first, well-being follows narrative, then we naturally treat non-adherence or low engagement as a failure to take up the intervention. But if we take the way symptoms shape one's ability to engage seriously, then non-engagement can be fairly reinterpreted as a signal that psychological prerequisites are not met. And this matters clinically, because the standard response to non-engagement is often to simplify the care plan or intensify persuasion. Of course, sometimes that works. But other times it simply increases guilt, reinforces failure narratives, and deepens the very barriers we're trying to overcome. I refer to this section as where the assumption breaks, and by that I don't mean that physical activity cannot improve mental health. What I actually mean by the assumption breaking is that it becomes incomplete when it treats the behaviour as the primary entry point, while ignoring the upstream constraints that determine whether that behaviour is actually psychologically available. And I know the obvious objection at this point is, But Will, isn't helping people overcome them barriers exactly what clinical interventions are for? And my answer to that is, yeah, sometimes. But there are two reasons why this doesn't fully resolve the problem. First of all, many interventions still embed activity as the lever and treat barriers as a secondary friction, rather than the primary causal drivers. Secondly, in high deprivation regions or contexts, psychological barriers are not acting alone. They are amplified by chronic stress, reduced opportunity, limited safe spaces, and cumulative disadvantage, which raises the psychological cost of initiation even further. Therefore, in those contexts, the failure to engage shouldn't be understood as mere unwillingness. It is often actually a predictable outcome of asking for behaviour change without meeting the conditions that make that change feasible. And once we see that, once we treat psychological barriers as causes of inactivity, and inactivity as something that then worsens mental and physical health, the relationship stops looking linear. It starts to look cyclical. Psychological barriers reduce activity, reduced activity worsens outcomes, and outcomes feed back into barriers. That cyclical model is exactly what I'm going to formalise in the next section. Now, before I introduce the model itself, I want to be clear about what kind of contribution I hope for this to be. This isn't a new intervention, and it's not an attempt to replace existing psychological frameworks like COM-B or self-determination theory. Many current approaches are evidence-based and effective under the right conditions. What this model is trying to do is explain a specific pattern that these approaches struggle with, namely, why interventions that centre on increasing activity tend to work unevenly and often perform least well in contexts where the need is highest. The core principle I hope to employ here is to treat psychological capacity as something that changes over time, rather than something that can be assumed at the point of intervention. So this model isn't a new solution. It's a way of explaining why some solutions succeed in some contexts and systematically struggle in others. Now, there are three subsystems in the cyclical model: the psychological subsystem, the behavioral subsystem, and the outcome subsystem. The psychological subsystem is the part of the cycle that must be in place before activity is even possible. When I talk about this level of the model, I'm not referring to attitudes or preferences, but to psychological capacities. These capacities determine whether someone can plan, start, and tolerate activity in the first place. And crucially, they are not fixed traits. They fluctuate, they can be depleted, and they're highly sensitive to stress, symptoms, and context. Therefore, if these capacities are compromised, perhaps through depression, anxiety, or chronic stress, then physical inactivity doesn't follow as a choice, it emerges as a constraint. Now, moving on to the second subsystem within this model, the behavioral subsystem. This is the part of the cycle that is concerned with activity engagement, and it is deliberately simple. It's not about attitudes or beliefs, it's about what actually happens. At this level, we're talking primarily about three things, which are initiation, which refers to whether someone can start the activity, maintenance, so whether the individual can sustain it over time, and adherence or dropout, which refers to whether the behaviour continues once the initial push fades. These behaviours are often thought of and treated as individual choices or compliance issues. But within this model, they're better understood as outputs of the psychological conditions I've just described. Therefore, in turn, now when we think of non-adherence, we're not seeing disengagement or a lack of motivation, but instead we're seeing the behavioural expression of upstream psychological constraints. And finally is the outcome subsystem. Now, this is the part of the cycle that refers to changes in mental and physical health that follow patterns of activity or inactivity. At this level, we're talking about things like mood, sleep, energy, symptom severity, and general physical functioning. These are typically treated as endpoints, the outcomes we hope exercise will improve, but in this model, outcomes don't just follow behaviour, they feed directly back into psychological capacity within that initial psychological subsystem. So when outcomes worsen, they directly reduce motivation, self-efficacy, and emotional regulation for the next attempt at activity. This is why I describe this part of the cycle as the point at which difficulties can become entrenched. Outcomes aren't the end of the process, they shape the psychological conditions under which future behaviour becomes more or less possible. And once we put these subsystems together, we can begin to see how this cycle can produce deterioration over time. The depletion loop, as I call it, begins with an increase in psychological barriers. As those barriers increase, initiation and maintenance of physical activity becomes more difficult and activity levels drop. Reduced activity then contributes to poorer outcomes, such as increased fatigue, lower mood, disrupted sleep, or worsening symptoms. Crucially, those outcomes then feed back into psychological capacity. Fatigue reduces initiation, low mood undermines self-efficacy, and heightened anxiety increases the likelihood of avoidance. With each cycle, the baseline level of psychological capacity is slightly lower than before. This is exactly how inactivity stops being a choice and becomes a trajectory. It is also important to say, however, that this same system can also generate improvement. The scaffolding loop, as I call it, begins when the psychological entry cost of activity is lowered, for example through graded tasks, external support, environmental adaptation, or reduced expectations. Lowering these entry costs reduces the immediate demands on motivation, self-efficacy, and emotional regulation, making initiation possible even at very low levels of activity. Small, supported successes then produce modest outcome gains, perhaps in the form of slightly improved mood, better sleep, or a sense of mastery. Those outcomes then feed back into psychological capacity by increasing self-efficacy and reducing perceived effort. And as a result, initiation becomes easier next time. Activities become more sustainable and capacity gradually strengthens. The same system can generate improvement, but only when entry costs are lowered. And that brings me to how inequality becomes locked into the cycle. The core structural claim here is relatively simple. In high deprivation contexts, this cycle has a lower threshold for entry and fewer exit ramps. Psychological barriers tend to be higher at baseline, perhaps due to chronic stress, financial insecurity, cumulative disadvantage. Opportunities for activity are often fewer, less accessible, or less psychologically safe. Physical and mental illness burdens are higher, which means outcomes deteriorate more quickly. And importantly, the price and consequences of failure are harsher. A missed session or an early dropout doesn't just interrupt progress, it further erodes self-efficacy, reinforces avoidance, and confirms that a sense of change just isn't possible. So the same feedback loop that might resolve in a low barrier context instead persists and deepens. Under those conditions, a linear intervention doesn't merely just underperform, it risks actually amplifying inequality. So the core claim is this: psychological capacity, physical activity, and mental health form a feedback system. And under conditions of high deprivation, that system is more likely to persist than resolve. What I've tried to show in the previous section is that the relationship between psychological barriers, physical activity, and mental health is not linear, but cyclical. Rather than a simple progression from increased activity to improved mental health, the cyclical model highlights feedback loops, where psychological barriers reduce activity, reduced activity worsens mental and physical health, and those outcomes then feed back into the original barriers. The next question is then, what follows from thinking about the relationship in this way? The first implication of thinking about the relationship in this way concerns where we assume intervention should begin. Many or most existing approaches implicitly assume that physical activity is an appropriate starting point, that if we can just get people moving, psychological benefits will follow. What the cyclical model suggests is not that this is wrong, but instead that this assumption may often instead be misplaced. If psychological barriers are already present, often long before any formal diagnosis, then inactivity may not be the primary problem to be corrected. Instead, inactivity may be the downstream expression of earlier psychological constraints. In those cases, asking people to increase physical activity without first addressing those constraints risks intervening too late in the cycle and failing to fully acknowledge the temporal depth of most mental health problems. In short, the model shifts the question from how do we get people to exercise to what makes exercise psychologically possible in the first place. The second implication of the cyclical model is to help make sense of why exercise-based interventions may underperform in regions like the Northeast. In context of high deprivation, high rates of chronic illness, and limited opportunity, psychological barriers are not only more prevalent, but importantly more entrenched, more locked in. This means that the cycle is already reinforced before interventions are even introduced. From this perspective, Poor adherence or limited outcomes are therefore not best understood as individual non-compliance, but instead as a result of both structural and psychological conditions that make engagement difficult from the outset. This reframing shifts responsibility away from individuals and towards the alignment between intervention design and lived context. There are, of course, limitations to this model. As I said at the beginning, this is still very much ongoing work, which I'm trying to iron things out and work things out still. One such example of a limitation I'm currently aware of would be that this model is the work of conceptual synthesis, rather than a causal test of specific mechanisms. So the model identifies plausible feedback loops, but does not isolate where psychological barriers are most causally dominant. Its purpose is therefore explanatory and integrative rather than predictive. Another limitation I'm aware of is that there's no single trajectory. The cycle doesn't necessarily operate in the same way across individuals, diagnoses, or life stages, and perhaps in its current form doesn't adequately capture the idea that people may enter the cycle at different points, experience different barriers, and respond differently to similar interventions. And crucially, this is a model for thinking differently. It is not a complete treatment protocol. This model is not designed or intended to be directly implemented, but instead to reshape assumptions about causality, timing, and responsibility in existing approaches. Overall, I hope that the cyclical model offers a robust reconceptualization of the relationship between psychological barriers, physical activity, and mental health that better reflects both lived experience and contextual inequality. Rather than treating inactivity as a simple cause of poor mental health, it helps to explain how treating inactivity as a simple cause of mental health Rather than treating inactivity as a simple cause of poor mental health, it helps to explain how psychological barriers can produce inactivity, how inactivity can then exacerbate mental and physical health difficulties, and how this cycle becomes entrenched in regions of high deprivation, such as the Northeast. I believe that the value of the model lies not in prescribing specific interventions, but in reframing where, when, and how intervention efforts are directed. In that sense, this is a model for thinking differently, not a finished treatment protocol, but one that may help make existing approaches to public health messaging and clinical intervention more realistic, more equitable, and ultimately more effective in the context where they are most needed.